Okay, picking up where we left off on page 572, we just finished the discussion about the make or buy decision. And again, you're not really making that decision here, but you're kind of leaning toward that decision here. Okay, the next thing you can do at this point is identify the alternatives. It could be that you could at this point come up and say, yeah, there most likely this is going to be a product that we can buy, or yeah, there's two different ways we could approach this, and so let's kind of identify each one. And so these are not design choices because we haven't done design yet. We're still just now trying to analyze. So after you've analyzed it, you say, well, there's two major ways we could do this. So you need to go ahead and give them equal weight and think about, and then later on we'll kind of make some decisions. So coming up with alternatives is probably, option one does this and option one does this. If you've ever been in the military, you know about decision papers where you list all the options and then at the end you recommend one. That's what we're talking about here, is that during our analysis, we came up with 3 alternatives and we're recommending alternative number 1. That's exactly what this is all about. But it's showing due diligence that you didn't just look at one answer to the problem. You're showing that you've done your work, you've done your homework. Okay, cool. And the next thing you talk about is that feasibility analysis again. This is the same feasibility analysis with the same 5 categories. But see, now you know a little bit more. In the investigation phase, it was basically just kind of a filter to throw out bad ideas. And trust me, you'll get some bad ideas in the investigation phase. In the analysis phase, now you're kind of going there saying, this is getting look like it's going to get kind of expensive. So now that you know what the requirements are, which you didn't know previously, you reapply the feasibility analysis a second time to determine whether or not any one of those 5 pop out. Okay. At the end, you end up with a report. So what's the report about? The report is essentially, here, the report is, I think this project is worthy of consideration. And so you're moving it up to the next decision point. So this is a go, no-go document where you're recommending approval to go to the next stage, which is design. So up to now, you really haven't spent that much money, okay? Investigation didn't really cost you that much. Perhaps you have a few people working on a staff. In my organization, I had industrial engineers and industrial engineer technicians that were sitting there at their desk whether I gave them something to do or not. So it was a sunk cost. So it didn't cost me hardly anything to have them do analysis and investigations. So investigation and analysis were okay. But when we moved to design, now we're talking about contacting vendors and having people come in and hiring people and blah, 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 blah. So this is kind of the make or break where the money starts to come in. So the analysis report says, okay, this is worthy, we need to move on. That's essentially what it is. Which brings us to phase 3. So phase 3 is all about the system design. So stop. Let's talk about what the goal is. So one more time, even though I've repeated this, hey, go away. I've repeated this several times. I'm going to repeat it again. Phase 1 is describe the problem. Phase 2 is give me a list of requirements. Phase 3 is what do I have to do to meet those requirements? You told me it has to do this. Now what do I have to do to make it do that? Okay? So it's all about what do I have to build? What do I have to buy? How do I satisfy the requirements? That's what it's all about. How do I do this? So you could look at it as phase 2 is what it must do, and phase 3 is how it must do that. It's the list of things you're going to have to do in order to meet the requirements. The output of this thing is going to be basically, I like to say, a shopping list. It's going to be a list of things you're going to have to buy or build in order to make this thing work. So output of the previous one was a go-no-go document. This one is really going to be a pretty good list of like a contract specification. The output is going to be, here is a list of everything this thing must do. Okay, cool. A shopping list. A list of technical specifications. Okay, let's go through this. Identifying, recruiting the team, developing the schedule, blah, 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 blah. Then we get to the good stuff about designing a user interface. So Skip over that. And now we talk about designing user interfaces. So there's a lot of techniques you can use for designing a user interface. But let's just go through these little principles first. So here's some interesting principles. So I'm trying to design a form on a screen, okay? So consistency. Make sure that you use the same terms, the same abbreviations, the same order in which things appear. When you go from one screen to another, it doesn't go from order num to order, and if the order number, then the description is in that order. Then when you go to the screen, it ought not be in a different order. So everything is consistent, looks the same, feels the same. It doesn't look like 5 different people produced this. When you switch over to another page, you should be able to say, "Oh, I got it. I don't need any help." So it's all about consistent menus and prompts and help screens, because they learn one screen and they've learned them all. Offer feedback, yeah. So remember we talked about source data automation. As soon as I type in a part number and move off to another field, it ought to pop up immediately and say, "Wait a minute, that's not a valid part number." So simple error handling as fast as you can. Make sure that they're not entering bad data. And the feedback should be kind of, don't annoy them with a bunch of okay prompts and that kind of stuff. If it's something critical, draw their attention to it. Otherwise, move on. One primary action per screen. The idea is if you're trying to enter an invoice, don't make them, if you can, put it all on one screen. Don't do half the invoice on one screen and then go to another screen, because people just don't think that way. Provide progressive disclosure. Show them exactly what they need, only when they need it. Just information to choose, and strive for aesthetic integrity. Make sure everything looks clean and neat and pretty. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, there are some techniques you can do. One is with a system basically called prototyping. And prototyping is I kind of develop what this thing's going to look like. It doesn't have, it's a mock-up, okay? It's not the real thing. And you show them, is this how you'd want your data entry screen? And they're going to say, yeah, but why don't you move this to over here and this to over there? And you go, why? And he said, well, because typically this is the default, and I don't ever have to change that. The system design default is probably correct 99% of the time, but this field is always blank and I always have to enter. So if you move them around, it'll make me more efficient. Okay, cool. So you get also the good feedback, and it's an iterative process. Well, how about this? And you go, no, and then you come back and how about this? And so you're showing them these prototype mock-ups of this user interface. And once you get their buy-in this way, when it comes time to actually running the system, they're going to already know how to operate it because they were essentially involved in the development of this thing. It's kind of cool. Okay. The next thing to talk about is some of the security things. And we kind of mentioned this before. Input controls. I got to have some way of maintaining the integrity and security. I have to be able to reduce errors. I have to prevent fraud. I have to do all sorts of, passwords, identification, and backing up. Output control. I got to make sure everything is sent to the right places, and documents and files. Database controls to make sure people don't have read and write permission on things they should not be. Telecommunication controls, transfer data between all the rest of these things. So this is all about the requirements. Remember, the requirements say, well, I have to have end-to-end encryption. Well, that's a requirement. So in the design, it's going to be, here's how I'm going to encrypt the transmission of data from point A to point B. You're going to be showing them that you've listened to their list of requirements, check mark on that requirement, and you move on. Okay. That's what that's all about. Okay. They go in and talk about things like disaster recovery, which is kind of cool because they don't want you to get to a situation where you're smack dab in the middle of a project and then someone says, well, I need high availability. And you go, whoa, time out. I thought, this was something else. So during the design, you're probably going to have to talk about things like disaster recovery. Where do I have backups of these things? Do I only have one data center and that's it? I don't have any way to operate my system at all. If the power went out for this one building, am I completely dead? You need to be thinking those things. Now, The user may not have ever asked for that as a requirement. Okay, back in phase 2, they may have said, oh, by the way, this thing has to operate, if the power is out for 3 days. They may have never actually said that. You're going to have to help them by saying, how reliable is the power in your area? And, that kind of stuff. Okay, so disaster recovery. There's some interesting things talking about, sabotage, terrorism, civil unrest. I tell you what, the most of the problems we have are, power and floods and tornadoes, that kind of stuff. Yeah, this is the things that we have. We've got a fire. Somebody digs a hole and cuts the power. That kind of stuff. So that's typically... So, again, let's assume that someone did have that as a requirement. And how are you going to deal with it? So the deal with it is you have these options. And they have these things called a hot site, which is another physical location with essentially identical set of servers and hardware and software. So when you buy... Essentially, you're buying everything in pairs. I buy 2 servers and 2 databases and 2 bits of software, and I install it over here and I install it over here. So this hot site could be physically located far enough away so that one disaster won't get them both. And so if I have a problem, I'll just switch over to my other site and have business continuity. Cold site or a warm site is, okay, I don't really have duplicates of everything because that's too expensive. But I have another empty room over here in the corner of the warehouse. It's empty. It's got all the power hookups. It's got all the network hookups. And if we had a problem, we could go wheel the servers to the other place and hook them up in a relatively short amount of time. So one is complete duplicate, which is very expensive. And warm sites and cold sites are, I've got everything in place so I could just move things and get things back up and running again. Cloud computing, of course, makes all this disaster recovery planning practically moot. Okay, so lots of good stuff in here. I am not going to go over database design. Hey, go take the database design course and learn all about this. I will tell you that a lot of people are very passionate about choosing a vendor at this point. I'm not. Typically in the design phase, I kind of sort of know, most people say, let the data decide, what database product you're going to use. So maybe that used to be the case, but now every database vendor can do everything that everyone else's database vendor can do. So this is kind of a dumb point. Pick one you want. It doesn't really matter anymore. Okay, I'm moving on. Okay, feasibility analysis for the 3rd time. Because now that you know what the requirements are, now you're going to have to design something that's going to meet those requirements. So now you know a heck of a lot more about, okay, I need to do point-to-point encryption over this. Okay, I'm going to need a VPN tunnel from here to here. I'm going to, you're going to have a shopping list of things you're going to have to buy. So now you need to go through and come up with how we're going to do this. In addition to the normal feasibility analysis of those 5 categories, we also have these advantages and disadvantages of whether I'm renting, leasing, or buying hardware, software, services, whatever it is. And so renting is typically a short-term kind of thing. And so they talk about, no long-term financial requirements, but yeah, it's probably going to cost you some. Leasing is, okay, I'm doing pretty good. I don't have to own the equipment. It's less expensive. And then, of course, purchasing, I have total control over everything. So this is a pretty good list of things you need to kind of pay attention to. Okay. And finally, we get to the point where we end up with the report. And so the report here is more than just a go, no-go document. Like in the other examples, we got to this report phase and it was like, well, do you want to take it to the next step? And that was basically all there is. And that's not the case here, but doggone it, I need a few more minutes. So I'm going to stop this now. We'll polish this off in just a minute or two.